We have, I see several people with questions, but I'm going to defer to my boss first. Dr. Sushlicky has a...
Very wise.
Eager question. Well, the first thought is that the Putin in Cuba is Ramiro Valdez, huh? And he's the guy that could...
Pero muy bien, muy bien.
No, I want to take on your thought about legacy, continuous legacy of Fidel Castro. And there are two aspects of the legacy that I think are there, although not in the same form as Fidel Castro. One is anti-Americanism. I think Raul continues a policy against the United States, voting in the United Nations, alliances with countries like enemies of the United States, like Iran, like Venezuela, and so on. So there are an element of anti-Americanism that is very, very strong at the elite of the Cuban government. And the second one is internationalism. Not in the form that Fidel believed in sending troops or sending guerrillas, but Raul continues to support Hezbollah and Hamas, continue to send weapons to countries like North Korea. So there are a number of internationalist activities that are continuing by this government, not unlike the ones that Fidel took on.
Basically, I'll go back to my presentation on the three options that these people have. They can either muddle through. If they are going to muddle through, that's the kind of foreign policy that they're going to stick to. If they want to switch to even a non-democratic regime, they eventually have to drop some of these alliances and try to open up to democratic Europe and other type of arrangements with the ICCAS, with the international. But to what degree this is ideological, or to what degree is simple fear of losing control if they move ahead, there is a balance there. I think that they're both. I think that on the one hand, there is this long entrenched anti-Americanism and that kind of thing. On the other hand, I think they actually are fearful of moving even from one type of totalitarian regime of governance to a non-democratic, autocratic regime of governance, because they fear that they are going to lose control. Now, the good thing is that they're so old now that somebody else would have to step in. Now, one little opinion of mine, and that is, everybody here probably remembers, because we have enough age to do that in the 60s, a radical sociologist came up with a book about who rules and who governs the United States. That's an interesting question for Cuba. Who rules and who governs? Because in terms of ruling, of really deciding at the end, that's the elite. And in terms of governing, then you have all the Diaz-Canel of this world and the other people. In many occasions, people think that because Laje or Perez-Roque or Diaz-Canel or whoever comes up in the front page of a press every day, they are very strong fellows, very strong guys. They are the dolphins. Well, in Cuba, the dolphins die very easily. So I'm not saying literally, but they stop being dolphins. I wouldn't like to be in an aquarium in Cuba. And so my recommendation is make that distinction, because one thing is to be Arnaldo Ochoa. He was a member of the elite. And another thing is to be Diaz-Canel or any of these guys that they can be thrown out of the window at any moment.
Thank you very much. Marifeli, would you like to?
Very quickly, anti-Americanism, yes, but there was anti-Americanism before 1959, and I would say that the resonance that part of Fidel's legacy once had among ordinary Cubans, you said it was elite, but among ordinary Cubans is nowhere near what it used to be. So what I'm saying is that legacy has ideological value, but does it have legs that walk among the people? I don't think so. And the other,
The anti-Americanism I was talking about is operational. In other words, the Cuban government uses anti-Americanism, makes alliances with anti-American regime. So it's not that somebody in the street doesn't like the Americans, it's that the policy of the Cuban government is anti-American.
I understood you, but I'm just introducing the Cheos and the Cheas into the picture. And internationalism, yes, in the sense that you spoke about it, but it is such a radically different international context. So I think that it's not entirely comparing apples and oranges, but it is so reduced compared to what it was. So, but you're right. Those are two elements of Fidel's legacy that will survive after whatever happens, or the next big happening in Cuba, but they will assume different forms, I think.
Let me just add. No,
Pedro.
just add that I think, Jaime, globalization, and I understand what you say, what the Cuban government sells is anti-Yankee, anti-Americanism. I don't think the Cubans are buying that. They will wish that they had never closed the doors and the communications with the Americans, with the U.S. And globalization is also a concept that is, in the last 20 years, is changing the perception, especially of the younger generations, where they see the world more as an attractive town, a combined, multiculturalism is taking shape in the world, and I think eventually we're moving into a world of multi feelings of nationalism, not the tribal things that we have lived for so many centuries, but hopefully into a world where we can feel closer the different nations as one global nation.
Joe Azel has a question, and then I'm going to get back to the other end of the room.
Well, this is for any one of the panelists because it's an observation that I think straddles both panels, the economic and the political. And it's a demographic condition that mitigates against progress either economically or politically. And that has to do with the median age of the Cuban population. Cuba is a very, very old country, one of the oldest in the world right now. So I think when we had the Arab Spring, and I forget the exact numbers, the median age of the Egyptian population is around 19 years old or something like that. In Cuba, it's, I don't know, 20s or 30 years old. So to what impact do we see that very old population mitigating against any progress in either front? Well,
I propose the younger person in the table to answer the question.
we'll throw it at you.
Well, Cuba, I'm sorry. Cuba, since before '59, it was an older population than other countries in Latin America. I'm not going to compare the world, which I don't know. But I'm not I'm not deterministic with any variable. I think we need a combination of variables. It is the younger people who are leaving Cuba, which happens when people migrate. But I don't think, the other day I was having dinner with some friends at their house, and the husband of the couple that invited me and others, he had a video on his tablet of young people in Havana dancing. It was sort of a rap cubanizado, and they were It was the rainbow of colors of people in Cuba. And then it was in a small town, I think he said Pinar del Rio, in which, no, it wasn't Pinar del Rio, it was in Santa Clara or Las Villas. They were all ages, but mostly young people, dancing and tocando tumbadora. So I, as much as I pay attention to the macro data, I like to see the faces of people. And what I saw there, I think that young people, we have one of them here, how many, about 15, 20 young Cubans who have been here at the Miami-Dade College, and they're going to go back to Cuba with, in a privileged position because they've been here and they have met with so many of us. So I think demography is an issue, but there are many other issues as well. And numbers don't always add up in politics.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one little detail. I mean, the demographics are important, but the productivity rate is very important. So technology is very important. Even if you have fewer younger people, but those people have total access to the current technology, if they are connected to the global economy, they can generate enough wealth to move the country ahead. Now, if we're thinking about the current state of affairs in terms of technology and the poor rates of productivity, then the demographic is totally against you in terms of sustaining that nation.
Carlos, did you want to comment on demography, or was it something else?
No, something else.
Let me, I want to take a question from the back, but let me say something about demography. Joe Marino Morillo spoke about this in a speech. He said it's an unsolvable problem, the demographic crisis. In the foreseeable future, it is unsolvable. So in that sense, it is somehow deterministic. The Cuban population is shrinking in absolute terms. There are fewer Cubans on the island today than last year, fewer last year than the year before. It's shrinking, it's aging, and it's emigrating. It's a pretty severe situation. For all the obvious reasons that you mentioned and that we could get into. But when you have a shrinking, aging, and emigrating population, the immigrants are largely nowadays are young people who are having their children here in Florida and not on the island. But we could talk about this for quite a while. The young lady in the back has a question.
Hi. My name is Marisol Medina. Mr. Blanco, you mentioned the 3 steps by which something great could happen domestically. Could a sudden death, perhaps Raul, or maybe, well, I don't think Fidel's death would cause any major change now, but could perhaps a sudden death in the higher spheres of government be that third event by which people feel perhaps inspired to do something domestically?
Of course. But there are two things. I don't think that the death of Fidel or Raul or something like that would spark people into, moving from a bystander position into an activist position. I don't think that what that may bring is a new dynamic within the ruling elite. Who's going to take over and with what kind of support? And then, in this type of regimes, not necessarily you need to be backed up, by social constituencies, but you cannot totally disregard the opinion of the street in terms of having a certain level of popularity to move ahead. So yes, of course, that may bring into the picture a new dynamic, but I wouldn't be so much concentrated in who's going to be next, as I would be observing what social groups within the elite or within the managerial class or within the bureaucracy or within the population can eventually have an impact in the politics immediately after an event like the one that you're describing.
Carlos Quijano?
Senator, at the end, you might be right in the sense that the
Thank you.
Russian
I have
model,
to tell that to my wife.
you might be right at the end of the Russian model. But I have a different reading. I think basically, if you look at the system, or what they say, if you look at the lineamientos, basically, they're trying to avoid the Russian model. It's a system based on state enterprises, foreign investment, and very, very small private sector. It has nothing to do with the perestroika, nothing to do with the Glasnost, etc. In a sense, if you, perhaps Raul doesn't want to make the same mistake that Gorbachev made. It's a different model. Eventually, it might evolve that way because of different circumstances, but that's not what they have in mind.
Right.
They have in mind
Let me,
very
you
straight
are-
enterprise.
I agree with you. I was thinking on the part that you mentioned now, eventually. But what I'm seeing is them positioning themselves on those places, controlling the economy and positioning themselves for the future. Now, how that future will, I don't think Raul has that in mind as we speak now. But I do think that the calendar is fast approaching for changes in Cuba. That how are they going to happen? Now, the death of Raul or the demise of Raul could precipitate a fight for succession of power among them. And that fight could even reach a level of a civil war among the different factions of the government. So there are different variables, and the death of Raul can be a huge precipitante.
Pedro, do you mean his death before he retires, if he actually does retire?
No, we're talking his death. I don't see Raul might retire himself from something, but I do think that he will, that's a personal opinion. I think Raul will remain the armed force chief. Somehow, I don't see Raul relinquishing in his lifetime what he has done for so many years. So.
I think we have time for two more questions, one here and then one here.
Quickly, I apologize because I'm going to ask a question, just a brief comment. It's great that you always bring us back to reality. In reality, it's a gangster state. But it ties in with what Mr. Quijano said. It is a Russian model, but it is modified. That's where I think they're going to. Why is it modified? Because the Castros cannot possibly afford to have that broad, okay, sort of control free capital model as the Russians, where the oligarchs control the big corporations, but there they are, they control the economy. That would be too much. That would make the system perhaps very vulnerable or possibly fall down. So they concentrated, but the intention is just that.
Let me say it again.
Gangster state.
Right, let me say it again, I agree. I am talking about Raul out of the picture.
Completely out.
Completely out. What I see with Raul out of the picture is them positioning themselves, the generals, the colonels, and others, some that are not even militaries, positioning themselves for the day when Raul is not in, and when inevitably Cuba will move in.
I just want to say very quickly that the Russian Putin model of the 1990s, which is not perestroika and glasnost, generated a large middle class for the very first time in Russian history. And the Cuban elite is terribly afraid of a vast middle class.
Yeah, that's a good point, too. One more question. Mario?
Yes. Thank you, by the way, for the political exposure. It's good for people like me to once in a while listen to to the other disciplines, right? So your discussion about the legacy reminds me of something that we find on our field, which is basically people who are helping or advising the Cuban government on economic policy. one of the legacies of Fidel, I think, is still they continue to say, yeah, we understand markets, we understand efficiency, but the central plan has to play a role, okay? And these are people who know capitalism because they travel to free market economies and they praise the efficiency of capitalism, but they say, well, the market has to play. So that's one legacy that I think is both political and economic. The other one is gigantic planning and gigantism. And it's being dismantled in Cuba. I just went and saw one of the largest escuelas al campo being completely, it's like a ghost town, right? But still there are people who say, and you read it in a discourse of the elite, if I understood the definition of elite correctly, we can produce more agricultural output, and all we need to increase agricultural output is not, capitalism, investment, etc. It's just to exhort the people to produce more. So it takes me back to, to the fact that here's something that both our disciplines have in common in terms of the legacy of, Fidel, the whole project.
Thank you,
Just a
Mar.
comment. They have 50 years to convince the people,
Yes.
and they cannot produce it.
Yeah, right.
Jaime, would you like to announce the event we're having here on Thursday?
Sure. General Rafael Del Pino has written a book about his experiences, and he will be here presenting his book this coming Thursday. So anybody who's free, open to the public. Thank you all. Thank you for the panel. Thank you for all the participants.
Thank you.